Hi everyone, this is Dan Sandhu. I'm the CEO of Sparks. I've been in education and particularly in EdTech for a long time now, and I wanted to spend some time with friends and colleagues from the industries, key individuals who've been decision makers, influencers, and commentators to really understand what was happening in education right now. Not particularly with EdTech, but generally in education. I'm from the EdTech background, so clearly my conversations will veer towards EdTech. So, welcome to a series of these conversations and about education and EdTech. I'm really looking forward to them, and we're going to kick off today. Hi, Ed.
Hi, Dan.
Welcome to this conversation. Before we kick off, would you like to introduce yourself so that the kind of audience understands who you are, your context, how long have you been in this particular space?
Well, yeah, a long time is the answer, Dan. I'm currently publisher and editor of the Assignment Report, which is I guess, a business intelligence newsletter for the education industry. And I would say probably 90% of our subscribers are trade, with the other 10% tend to be investors. And we've got a similar split between the UK and international companies. I'm also, as I say, I've been in the education sector for as long as I can remember. Actually involved in a couple of businesses that we've started and subsequently sold. One was Cambridge Education Consultants, and the other business was Optimus Education. So that's really my background. And I think with the Assignment Report, we basically drill down into what's happening in the industry, both the sort of deals, the financial results, the what makes companies ticks, and we do more sort of granular research.
Thanks, Ed. Yes, of course. Anyone who's in the education sector, education technology sector, and the school sector and universities has heard of Assignment Report and are hopefully subscribers. I've been a subscriber for as many years as I can remember. This is not a plug to get a free subscription, but yeah, I'm always up for a free subscription. In that period, and you've seen a lot of changes, and you've seen a number of governments, and obviously loads of Secretary of States come and go. In the context of that, and bringing it right up to date, what do you think currently are the key issues that education, particularly education technology businesses, are facing from sort of an investor perspective?
Well, I think Dan, it often depends on the stage of growth of that company. So I think for early stage companies, I think, and these are some of the questions that we often ask when undertaking projects for investors. I think for early stage companies, the sort of key issues that you're going to get asked are, what problem is your software, your product actually solving? Is it scalable? What's the compelling reason to actually buy your product over the others? And I think another element which is also important is often overlooked is both the go-to-market strategy. Actually, have you thought that out before you've come to look at investors? And secondly, the people. I think one of the key things that we see in businesses, particularly as they grow, is if they got the right skill set. I think so many at the early stage are often have either come from the sector or are technologists, but aren't necessarily salespeople. And I think as you move up the chain to those more established businesses, then clearly investors are looking at the financials. They're looking at the evidence. Does your product actually deliver what it said it was going to do, as well as what are still the opportunities to grow your business? So I think they're the sort of key issues, and as I say, they do vary from the stage at which your company is at.
Yeah, really interesting. And I saw you on a presentation recently where you talked about the value drivers in terms of creating value, and they match up really well. And just to go back to what you said, I think for me it's always been you get the people right, you make sure you have a real good product or proposition. We have predictable revenues. You've got a potential in the market, and the ability to build partnerships. And I think people are at the key, and I'm glad to hear investors are still looking at that. The sector has always suffered the invasion of technologists who want to be in education, as opposed to more educationalists who are adopting technology. So I think that's
and I think, Dan, in one way, there's probably, and I think this is an issue for the sector generally is that there's potentially too many businesses out there. The in a one way the actual cost of entry is lower than it
That is fascinating.
than it used to be.
I've never quite thought of it that way, but you're absolutely right. There is a lot of businesses, and particularly if they're UK focused, and we all know there's just under 4,000 secondary schools and 19 odd thousand primaries in the school sector, and then the universities number far fewer. It's a small market for a lot of players. Does that explain why there are a lot of players with not a lot of scale? Is that one of the reasons?
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons. I think the work we've done across the sector for a number of companies is to look at particular verticals, and within each vertical, there's not much room for more than 3 to 4 players. I think you're doing well, as you say, in terms of numbers. If you hit a third market share, 1,500, 1,600, I think you're doing very well. But when you've got lots of other what we describe as sort of challengers or indeed chasers at the early stage, then it's it's tough. But there are other reasons in terms of scalability. I think again you talk about perhaps the last decade or more, is that the demise of, to some extent, Vector, and also, but particularly particularly for products that are focused on, if we're looking at the sort of primary sector, I think a lot of newcomers into the market, even whether they were technology or just straightforward publishing companies, I think were dependent for a long time on the role of education advisors in local authorities. So these had a significant role in you would talk to an advisor in XYZ local authority, and they would bring in the primary schools to actually look at your product, and the channels to market are more diverse now within the sector. And I think it's often, you talk to companies and they've got 200 subscribers, but actually, well, how do you get to 500? These are sort of challenging things, and I think that, in a market which is to some extent on the curriculum side, where I think multi-academy trusts are still not necessarily purchasing sort of curriculum solutions, particularly at the primary end for their schools, then it's still a challenge for small companies to actually sell to the number of schools that are out there.
Yeah, no, great point in terms of just the ability to scale past that natural ceiling that we see a lot. And you're right, in the school sector, 300 to 500 schools is a ceiling. In terms of COVID, I mean, tragic that it was and horrific for lots of families. Do you think that has flushed out the market in terms of the long-term sustainable EdTech players, particularly versus the faddy ones or the ones that come and go?
Yeah, it might still be too early to say. I think we saw at the start of COVID. I think we saw that those companies that were well established, which had a degree of scale. So there we're talking about maybe sort of that sort of 1,000 to 1,500 schools at least subscribing to their product, or were early stage companies that were well funded and at the right stage. They were able to almost surf the
wave,
the 2 years. I think what we have seen, though, that perhaps those companies that didn't have the scale, those companies didn't have the funding, who went in the direction of very much went in the direction of offering a sort of a freemium service, have, on the basis that schools, when they were back to normal, would convert to a paid subscription. I think they have, for a number of reasons, struggled to convert. Part of that is because post-COVID, schools don't have the headspace to look at new products, because their focus is very much on the whole issue of catch up, and I think secondly, there's always the ongoing budget squeeze that's on schools, and I think there's an issue now, of course, with which I'm sort of picking up speaking to people in industry. Of course, is the likely impact of increased energy costs on schools, which will, for some, and particularly those companies that aren't necessarily well established, that will become a greater challenge as they're fighting for a potentially a smaller budget going forward.
That's really interesting. So sort of what you're saying is those that had a bucket full of cash rode the wave based on the bucket full of cash. Those who had a volume of schools were able to survive because of the volume of schools. Yeah. I mean, I think that's quite insightful, because I think, personally, I think there has been quite a change in perception of EdTech at one level, particularly. Changing the perception of EdTech, particularly around what is demanded and not demanded by schools. I think the Multi Academy Trusts have played a role. However, and that's increasing the recent announcement that whole MAT structure is going to attract more and more schools into the MAT structure will make a difference. And we work with some of the best ones and some of the largest ones in the country, and we've noticed how those groups are getting increasingly involved, but your point is well made in terms of not directly involved in curriculum, but from an advisory perspective.
Yeah, I think Matt's indeed. I think they're increasingly having a greater role in making sure the infrastructure works, because right. I think COVID showed that for a lot of that infrastructure did not work initially.
From an investor perspective, and I've been fortunate in my career of having worked with private equity and venture capital, both in the UK and the US. What do US investors view the UK market as? Because at one level, you could view the UK market as being very small. On another level, and it's probably because we are in the UK, I can say this, it's quite prominent globally as an education player. So how do US investors view the UK market?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, I think if you look at education from school to higher education, corporate learning, I think the key things we see from US investors is back to that, not just scalability in the UK, but it's scalability globally. Yeah. So areas like university, higher education and tech around that, or indeed the provision of higher ed, that's very attractive, as is corporate learning and those kind of platforms. Increasingly, people are looking, both US investors are looking at what we're doing in using technology to reduce the skills gap. So there's a number of things happening, and I think when it comes to the sort of K-12 side, I think US companies are looking at those areas which scale best, i.e., and it's unsurprisingly in the sort of maths and science areas, and also providing the platform. I think the key thing in the K-12 side is the opportunities that you get going into international schools. I think that's a significant one. But you've also equally got companies from Scandinavia and elsewhere looking at.
I was just about to ask,
which you've seen recently.
I was just asking about the Nordic region, because that's been quite active both in the school space and the university space.
Yeah, both. And I think what you're seeing there is seeing the UK as a basically a platform to which to go into English speaking markets.
And we are fortunate that we've got some great brands, and without picking sides, Oxford or Cambridge are really good brands to have, in terms of the union flag flying. In terms of the EdTech space in the UK particularly, there's a lot of VCs playing in that space, and I find that sometimes difficult to reconcile with the life cycle the VC has of flipping or selling companies onwards versus private equity. Where do you think that balance is? Is there a shift more towards private equity, or is it just a point of scale?
Well, it's partly a point of scale, but I think the other thing to realise is that there are a lot of companies out there that are notionally trade.
Yeah.
That are actually backed by private equity. So what you're seeing is that there are investments that are being made, or acquisitions or investments that are being made by companies that are trade, but they're actually backed by private equity. So they're making indirect. And there's one, obviously a handful that do very well. GL Education has been one that's attracted private equity, but you've got to get to a certain scale. But I think what you're seeing is that private equity money is doing very much often buy and builds in this sector, and particularly, and again we've seen that in the last 2-3 years, not necessarily so much on the curriculum side, but on the what I would call the back office, the sort of infrastructure, the support services so there's been a lot of consolidation in that sector, driven by companies that are all backed by private equity.
I think that's a fascinating way to look at it. So it's private equity, not directly, but as a buy and build mechanism. That's interesting. I mean, I've seen recently, and we know there's been some private equity space activity happening in the UK, but also from private equity or private equity vehicles from the Nordics coming in to do acquisitions in the UK as well. That's interesting. In terms of the ability for EdTechs to raise funds in the UK, has COVID made a difference in that at all?
Well, I think it's an interesting sort of life cycle, the cycle over the last couple of years. I think is that I think what we've seen is that the COVID has created a lot of excitement. I think it was almost a sort of inflection point for technology in across the whole piece from K-12 through to everyone now realizes that actual digital learning is here to stay and works. And I think that got a lot of people very attracted. It equally got a lot of business owners very attractive about potential exit multiples. And I think what you're, so I think the last year was very exciting in terms of exit multiples. And I think what you're seeing this year, and it's partly what's happening in the US in terms of the tech stocks on NASDAQ, etc., is that you're those sort of valuations that, you've got some major sort of tech stock there that have reduced 30-40% over the last 6 months. I think people are now taking stock here in the UK in terms of valuations. And
there were some quite rich valuations last year, and some people we both know benefited quite well out of that. However, but I think there's a reality check, particularly if you want to be acquiring into that space.
So I think if you've got a good asset in the right place and it's got it ticks all these boxes, then I think there's still a good value. But I was speaking to someone yesterday, actually in the Netherlands, and was saying that his sector, last year it was 12 times annual recurring revenue. This year is 5.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Okay. This is a sector of the education sector.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
As a you see lots of as an expert commentator in this space, you see a lot of EdTech products. Obviously, I'm not going to ask you about Sparks, but pick a few which you think are really doing well and making a difference.
Well, it's a good question. Yes, I think because for me it's which ones actually do make a difference, really, and that's not necessarily the ones that are doing well.
Correct. That's
as you know, and it's a difficult one to actually name. But I think one company that's done particularly well that sort of pivoted itself was Twig, that we know.
That's right.
A Scottish company, but it was funded by DC Thompson and
Yep.
Imperial College.
That's right.
Went to the US, took a punt on competing with the big publishers on an adoption program in California, and it won. It's done, and it's been sold, and that's. That for a number of reasons is very successful. But interestingly, some of the most successful are not necessarily the most techie as such in the sector.
And I think a lot of it plays to what needs and problems are being solved, and I totally get it. It would be silly to assume, and I think this is definitely a lesson for the listeners, is that technology with education doesn't necessarily make it work. Education with some technology is much better. And just before we draw to a close, when you were at school all those millions of years ago, what did you think the future of education was going to be like? Was that even something you ever thought about?
Probably not. No, I think one of the interesting things is that taking my, as they were then, O levels back in back in the mid-70s, it is quite extraordinary to think that I was unable to take computer science, or whatever it was called then, because it was a CCSE.
Of course, yes.
So it was deemed inferior to an O level, and so the school sent me down the O level route, and the CSE, computer science, it was extraordinary. Oh, don't touch that. That's not that's not as good as an academic O level. And interesting, one of my good mates from then, he actually did take a CSE computer science and became a senior person at Tesco in their IT department.
There you go.
So
things have changed.
Yes.
Well, to draw it to a close, Ed, if I were to ask you what question in education or EdTech would you like me to help answer with my future guests, what question would you want me to ask them, which would help you in some way?
Well, I guess I think general. That's a good question. I think probably it would be good to ask people if they're incubate. What what are they taking into account in terms of their new product when they're incubating a new idea, whether they're a startup or a already established business? Who are they talking to? What are they? Are they actually reaching out to teachers, to support staff, whoever, head teacher, whatever? To make sure that the needs of the school or the needs for the product are actually met by the product that's actually delivered. A rather long question.
No, I will make a note of that. I have done, and I will ask that in the future. Ed, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. For those who don't subscribe to the assignment report, please do so. It's a fantastic monthly online newsletter now that comes out.
It's online as well, yes.
It's online.
Yeah, okay.
Ed, thank you very much. Well, to the listeners, that was a great first conversation to have with Ed. Hopefully you got a sense of what's happening from an investor perspective in the UK, but the perception of international investors and what drives value, but also what's important in education and how COVID has affected that. Well, thank you everyone for listening in. I look forward to talking to you all soon again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.